Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. As always, this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking this week with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who many of you know is one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro, but you may not know she is running for re-election on the November ballot. And so we are turning the tables and we are speaking with Emilie today as with her candidate hat on. Welcome, Emilie.
Thanks, Olga. It's really good to be here. I wish I had brought a little hat I could have popped on at that moment. That would have been adorable.
You probably should have brought like a bunch of hats. So because you're probably going to have to change them.
I do have some like right anyway. I'm not gonna do it. There's like a whole collection of straw hats on the wall.
It's so tempting though, right?
It's very tempting. Very tempting. I'm very glad to be here. I'm glad that we're flipping the tables, and that I have an opportunity to actually talk to you about my thoughts, not just react to other people's thoughts.
Well, and on that note, I think we should start with the question that I've been asking all the candidates, and yours is actually going to be special. You're going to have a 2-part question. First is, why did you choose elected service to begin with, of all the ways you could serve your community? And then second, this will be campaign number 3. You're just coming off 2 bienniums, so 4 years. What keeps you coming back?
Fun. I feel like we've talked to a few people who are like, I knew that I wanted to go into politics when I was in 5th grade and I ran for class president. Not me. I have been really interested in government for most of my adult life.
Oh, interesting.
So in my youthful years, I was like really had like that deep teen anti-authoritarian streak. And for a period in college in my early 20s, I was really interested in anarcho-syndicalism, honestly, which is basically like, how can we self-organize? And I was really interested in ways that even in America right now, we can self-organize, because I felt that the government was failing me and my loved ones. And then I very quickly, for work, started working for large nonprofits that mostly consulted with the government or had contracts with the government, and began really spending most of my work life either working very closely with government or waiting tables, or bartending or whatever. And which is a thread that we will carry, I think, through many of these conversations. But the bridge between like that question that haunted my youth, which is like, how can we self-organize, really came into like, government is how we self-organize. And how can government be a better tool for self-organizing? And so throughout my work career, working internationally, working nationally, I was really interested in like, how can government be more accountable to the people it's serving? And that's what's sort of the thread through a lot of my work life. And as I worked more and worked less nationally and internationally and more in Vermont government and Vermont nonprofit spaces, and lived in Brattleboro, who I love so much, I love you, Brattleboro. I realized that there was only so far I could go in terms of impacting the questions that I was asking and the issues I cared about as a government or a nonprofit employee, given just that, like, power in those positions in Vermont really sits in Montpelier and in Burlington, and I was here. And so a lot of it is I really just felt like sort of the next step in answering the questions I wanted to answer and making a difference on the issues I wanted to make a difference on. To do that from Brattleboro, I really needed to run for office. It was just sort of like the next sphere of influence to make a difference on what I wanted to make a difference on. The
Mhm.
politics part of it, the running for office part of it, that was like all very terrifying and alienating to me. It was actually serving that was interesting to me. There was a period of
Mhm.
time where I wanted to work for the Government Accountability Office or the Census in DC, really just like love the workings of government and making government work better.
So that's interesting. What I'm hearing is at some point you made this shift from wanting to be out, being outside the system, looking in,
Mhm.
and perhaps even wanting to take that system, dismantle that system,
Mhm.
to kind of like working within the system to change it.
Mhm.
Do you remember kind of like what made that shift for you?
Um, I think for quite a while, I had a sort of an academic's view of like, I'm learning more about the system, I'm trying to understand the system, but I don't have a right to impact the system or impact people's lives, given sort of how violent American institutions are.
Mm,
And then at some point, I think right around when I had a kid, I realized that we're all impacting everything every day, and the fact that I thought I could be sort of an objective observer or analyst to these issues was a farce. And I'm impacting my community every day with how I behave, with the work I
mhm,
do, with the way I walk down the dirt road and talk to my neighbors.
mhm.
And so I might as well sort of admit that and fully embrace it.
Oh, interesting.
I the sort of like big crossing point, which was in sort of like my original stump speech when I ran for office, and I was going to spare you today, Olga, but I'll tell you the story. Um, it's sort of overly dramatic, but it's true. It's not like a made up drama story for the sake of the stump speech. I was living in DC after living in Burlington after grad school with my son. And I was
Mhm.
working in an international development agency, consulting. It was like a consulting firm. And I was in Tanzania and Kenya, doing some analysis of bringing last mile internet connectivity, an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart, Olga,
Oh,
to,
especially this week, yes.
yes, to rural farmers
Mhm,
in Tanzania and Kenya so that they could get better pricing information for their crops. So,
mhm.
like, there's a lot of power if you have good farm gate information.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know anything about Kenya and Tanzania. Like, I did research before I went there, but like the people in Kenya and Tanzania are the ones who know a lot about Kenya and
Mhm,
and so I was there like learning and connecting things and connecting dots and helping make things happen. And I came home from that trip, ready to write the report, was going to take some time off away from the office at friends' houses in like on the Brattleboro Dummerston edge out on Sunset Lake Road to like do my work and have some time away from the office. And they didn't have any internet at their house. It's just like, what am I doing with my life? So, like, honestly, I went back to Burlington. I met with the owner of the firm, and I left my job and I moved to Brattleboro and I started working the front desk at Economic Services like 3 weeks later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, as a big fan of getting out of our comfort zones and feeling that travel's part of that, it never fails to teach us something about ourselves and our home
Yeah.
when we get out of our comfort zone. Um, yeah, I laugh because you're not the first lawmaker who has been like, well, I was traveling and I was in the middle of nowhere and I had cell service and internet, and then I got home and there was nothing.
Yeah.
Yep. So just for the sake of listeners, I'm in the process of moving, and I'm moving from a place where I had the choice of one internet provider to where I called 5 different internet providers before I found something that would work. for my
And we
rural.
don't actually know if it will work. We will find out.
We
Very
will find
soon,
out.
listeners. If
It
you
has
don't
worked
get
for my neighbors, so I'm
right.
assuming it will work for me.
But folks, if you don't get an episode for a few weeks, know it's because Olga's trying to find the internet.
Yes, yeah, she's running around with her cell phone going, internet, come back. Come find me. It's going to be interesting.
Oh, there was a second part to that question. Oh, why am I still doing it?
Why do you what keeps you coming back to it? Especially because I know that campaigning is not always your fun part. You like going out and knocking on doors and talking to people.
Mm-hmm.
You like that part of campaigning, but the politics part is not necessarily your favorite part.
I keep on doing it partly because I love it. Like, I just love every part of it. I love being involved in so many different aspects of policy. I love that my natural curiosity to like understand the web of things and how they connect to each other is so well served and serves my community so well. I love the deep wells of compassion that I need to find for different perspectives in order to survive there. I think it's like very good for I'll say my soul. And I feel like I'm serving the community really, really well. I've gotten a lot done in some less public ways, for getting funding to Mountain Home around their flooding. I just feel like I've been a really effective advocate for people's voices down here, and that feels really good. And that whole piece about me sort of like realizing at some point that like, the government is actually ours, and the government and, taxes are how we actually like organize ourselves and self-organize. The idea of sort of really practicing that with trying to connect our community in a deeper way to government is a project that I think it will take many years for me to feel even slightly successful at. And so like the process of continuing to try at that through this show Olga, through like just such a weird variety of community forums, I'm always sort of trying something new and being like, is this the thing people will show up at? And so that process of like continually learning and discovering is really fun. I also, when I first ran, I was like really scared of the politics part. And I still don't really enjoy like a ribbon cutting or a fundraiser. But I do actually, when I think about the politics part as like how to talk about like deep value and policy discussions in a way that people hear and connects to their life. And like, that's really what politics is at like a 20,000 foot non-judgmental level. That part I really, really enjoy. That like deep simplification of all of this complexity into like, what does this matter for someone's life? And like, why might they want to show up and participate in it? I love that part.
Yeah, the why does this matter question. And we should note that you do have someone running against you.
I do.
Terry Martin.
That's the rumor.
And you did reach out to him and say, let's do forums, let's talk. I think you even invited him on the show, and he declined. If you change your mind, Terry, and you want to join us, you are more than welcome anytime, of course. But just so listeners know, that offer was made. So what is it, when you think about your first day in the State House and you think about now, a little newbie with her wide eyes and all her hopes and dreams. And now, I will assume there are still hopes and dreams.
Oh my God, more dreams than I had before.
What has been a representative for the state of Vermont? How has that changed you?
You don't ask other people that. That's a great question.
I know. I just thought it, but I should be asking other people.
I went for a walk with Isaac Evans-France yesterday, who ran against Peter Welch in the primary, and I asked him that question. So anyway, how has it changed me? Well, it's funny that you said wide-eyed. There's the pictures that are on most of the pictures that are on the State House legislative website, where like there's that weird sort of flaggy background in the back.
Yeah. And you're talking about the reps and the senators' individual pages. Yeah.
Yes, on their actual pages. All of those pictures are taken at the end of the first day of the session. And my eyes are like so tiny in that picture. I was so tired by that point. And like my hair was so like disheveled. Like I was just like windswept and lost by that. So it's funny.
There's some wisdom taking at that time then.
Terrible choice. So I like have this very like, I mean, I don't know if I would remember exactly how I felt at the end of that day, if not for this really horrific picture of myself that gets pulled out sometimes for other shots.
I have to look at it now.
So how has it changed me? I think for the first thing is that I think for most of my life, I was disparaged, punished, vilified. I don't really have the right word, but I didn't get a lot of positive validation for my desire to ask tough questions. And it's been extraordinary to be in a place, in a space where that is actually like the most important quality I could bring. And so my sort of internal compass has grown a lot stronger through that time, being in a space where like my skills are valued. And like honest, my skills at being like a fairly difficult person in certain instances are valued, you know, like that's it's not a quality that's like really, you know, quite frankly valued in a lot of, you know, workplaces, unless you're in charge. So that's been really incredible. My righteousness has faded in a way that I feel both like constantly worried and very sustained by. I think we've talked a lot on the show before about how activism can burn very bright with anger. And I think across the political spectrum, it's very easy to motivate people with disagreement. Or with calls of those people. I think we're like seeing that play out in America right now. And I think a lot of that was what motivated me to run. Those people don't know what it's really like to live here. Those people don't know how hard it is to raise a family. Those people, if they just understood what I understood, would be doing what I want to do. And now I know that a lot of those people do actually understand how hard it is. And some of those people just have a really different perspective on what change looks like. And that you can't, like, that kind of fire burns bright and dies out. And so I've found other ways to motivate myself towards what is still like a very, very clear vision of justice, but feels like a more sustaining source to be motivating myself from. And it's a lot more around sort of curiosity around like, so if this thing here, like it's really like questions about like, so if this thing here is really not working for anyone except for 5 people, like why is it still there? Like why has this thing not changed? Why does it? And so that's like a big shift, I think, in me and in my sense of self. It's hard for me, Olga. I can like keep on going for a while, but I'm realizing that's really also hard for me to separate like what has changed as a result of being in the legislature for 4 years and what has changed as a result of the pandemic, because
Oh,
I have,
interesting.
been legislating more time through the pandemic than not through the pandemic. And I think we
Mhm.
all changed very deeply from the pandemic.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So I will stop there, though I think there are probably dozens of more things I could come up with.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Emily, because what I also hear in that is that interesting tension between standing on the outside, which can be hard,
Mhm.
and you need that fire when you are
Mhm.
standing on the outside. But there's also, when you're standing on the outside, it's also easier to be right, quote
Mhm.
unquote, because you're not necessarily having to challenge yourself
Yeah.
and work with perspectives that aren't your own.
Mhm.
And so I think it takes some courage to make that shift, and to find ways to keep that fire going in a sustainable
Mhm.
way that provides heat that people can keep warm by and cook by and sustain themselves by, rather than just a forest fire
Mhm.
that just burns.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is I have like a really deep distrust for power.
Mm,
Um, and
hmm.
now I have a lot of it.
Yeah.
And there are days where I'm like, wait a minute, if I can't do something about this, like who can?
Hmm.
What what's happening here exactly? Um, like there's not like sort of that next level. And I don't know if I think it was Michelle Obama. I'm sorry if it wasn't, who said something about like there was just sort of this moment where she was sitting at the table with like, all the people in charge and was like, oh, these are the people in charge? Like, that's a little weird. Like worst like misquoting ever. That's just like my like very bodily felt memory of whatever it was that maybe Michelle Obama said. But I've certainly had like moments like that, like, oh, huh, it's us. And like we're all just human and like deeply fallible and like also hopeful. And this person that I feel like might have power over me, it's like it's really interesting to be at a part in my life where like so much of that power is consensual.
Hmm. Hmm. Uh, Tell us a little bit more about that, like consensual power,
So
and
a
how
funny
you're
thing about the
defining that.
legislature and the power structure of the legislature, and people like
Hmm.
talk about the party and like how everyone's like, there's a whip and everyone's like in line and not in line and all that stuff. And like it all gets very dramatized, I think. But the legislature is essentially run like a worker run co-op
Mm. Hmm.
in that we elect the person who sort of sets direction and decides what committees we're on. Um,
The
she's
Speaker of the House.
the
Yep.
Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader.
Hmm.
Um, she's only there as long as we keep her there.
Mm,
She
good point.
takes feedback. We decide our own pay and salaries based on what we sort of, think the wider public is willing to bear.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I think we might misunderstand what the wider public is willing to bear, but that's a different conversation. And so being in a situation where the folks who are sort of ultimately keep me in this position of power are 4,000 voters
Hmm.
who I need to work my butt off in order to get feedback from. And then
Hmm.
the person that I am asking to sort of hold my work life in their hands is also someone that I, voted into power myself, and have regular conversations with. If I call her, she calls me back right away, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And so that sort of consensual nature of all of those power relationships is so different from any other sort of piece of my work life I've ever sat in. And it even changes my own experiences of both like other parts of my work life because I have other jobs,
Hmm.
and it changes my experiences of um, how I perceive democracy.
Mm. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I'm trying to relate that to my experience as a journalist, because some of what you're saying um, holds true
Mhm.
for my experience there too. For example, finally having a place where asking lots of questions was, some people preferred it didn't happen, but it was expected. And also, stepping into a situation where suddenly I had new power and a lot of power, and I went from to having a voice that was actually very loud, even if I wasn't saying much, simply from the position of being a journalist. Um, so I appreciate you sharing that, because I think when we as humans have power in our communities, we need to constantly evaluate, how we got it, what we're doing with it,
Mhm.
um, and if we're walking our talk and being in integrity.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of sort of interesting shades of it where, I realize that if I attend a meeting, even if I don't speak, I'm taking up more space than other people at that meeting. And what is the consequences of that? Or are those consequences that other people have consented to?
Mhm.
Um, if I ask a question that's just like straight out of my curiosity, then sometimes that means that and I ask it aloud, that means that someone else might then have to do 10 hours of work to answer my question.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's not fair. So I in some ways have to be more careful with my questions.
Yeah.
Um, and so that sort of knowledge of my positional power and that being so clear to me, I think helps me see other aspects of power that I might hold in relationships or in community. The other big sort of change for me, which again might be a COVID change and might be a legislative change, and might be both of them, is that I have a very different sense of time and how I sit in history than I did before.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
there's a tradition in the State House of regularly the names of anyone who served and has passed, who died since the last time we met, is read aloud in the chamber.
Mm.
And then we have a moment of silence. And
Mhm.
knowing that at some point, even if I leave Vermont for 50 years, my name will be read aloud in that chamber when I die, it's it is so deeply impactful. I'm even getting teary thinking about it now. And
That's huge. Yeah.
um that sort of paired with knowing through the sort of depths of the pandemic that this moment would be in history books in a way that other moments that I've lived through haven't.
Mhm.
And of course, the insurrection in the Capitol is also I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that have happened lately
Yeah.
that I'm this is going to go in the history book. Um,
Oh, yes.
no matter who writes it, this will be in the history book. Has really sort of extended my sense of cycles of time, how revolution happens, how cultural change happens. Um, I don't want to talk about Rebecca Solnit too much, but that's also a big shift for me, to sort of see how one little flicker in one spot can really lead to change even just a few years later in another spot, but you might not see the impacts for another 50 years, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
feel patient with that in a really deep way.
Well, on that note, we have come to the end of the first section of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Hang tight. Emily and I will be back after we hear from some of our underwriters. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour. Here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us at our Facebook page, The Montpelier Happy Hour. Send us an email at themontpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. You can find us on our Captivate page, wherever you find podcasts. And a huge thank you to BCTV, who picks up our YouTube video and shares it across Vermont. We appreciate that very, very much. And if you're just joining us, I am speaking with regular contributor, and in this case, wearing her candidate hat, Emilie Kornheiser. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Did you know that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests and not the station?
I did not, but I'm so glad you reminded me.
So glad to.
No, I did, but I like to
Yes.
forget.
I've been trying to figure out for the last half hour what is going on with the lighting in my office because it is very yellow today.
Oh, really?
And I
Does it look that way?
realized that it's because it is all coming through a web of red and yellow leaves because it is like full autumn out here. And so, I mean, of course, that would be what would be happening. So,
Enjoy it.
yes, for
Enjoy
anyone on
it.
YouTube who is wondering, and for anyone inside the podcasts or radio who just wants to imagine, there's a lot of autumn out here. Probably a lot of
beautiful
autumn wherever
autumn.
you are.
Mhm. I think so. Yeah, I have out the window I'm looking out of beautiful, beautiful evergreens. And so there are some gold, orangey gold leaves against these beautiful deep evergreens. And that's beautiful, but not full on autumn yet. So Emilie,
Mhm.
my favorite question, your least favorite question that I've been asking all the candidates is if you could enact one policy that would make Vermont work better for everybody, what would it be?
Mhm.
And I want you to do something a little different. I want you to think about what, you said you have a very clear vision. So what to you, you have your vision, what policies need to happen between now and that vision
Mhm.
to bring that to reality?
Yeah.
Knowing full well that you are only one of what,
150 people in the House, and then there's the Senate and the governor,
yes.
voters, and yeah.
So with that disclaimer.
Yeah, like please, people remember that disclaimer. I I have my own journey with Nancy Pelosi, but as I'm sure we all do, and there's also some probably good sexism and anti-ruling class stuff like mixed in with that as well, in addition to whatever her own experiences. But there was this really funny interview I saw with her yesterday where a reporter was saying why didn't Biden push harder to pass abortion protections? And she's like, we don't have the votes in the Senate. We need the votes in the Senate. So we're going to do it after the midterms if we win. And the reporter pushed back and she's like, you know how the votes work. Why are you asking? It was so amazing. And it was just she was just like, I can't, why are you playing and pretending that you don't actually understand how the Senate works? You've been a reporter in DC forever. It was really funny. Anyway, so yeah, just one lady, not in charge of all the people. Who knows what would happen if I was, but people aren't very bossable, as other people might know. So web of policy and what levers I would pull to get there. So I have been reflecting through this particular campaign season on how challenging it is to get people out, to get people participating, feeling like I'm not trying hard enough, or trying hard isn't good enough, or I don't know, having lots of feelings. And as I do that, on my better moments, I remember that until a few years before I ran for office, I had no idea who my state representative was. I did not vote in every election. I was just trying to make my life work.
Yeah.
And all the rest of it was noise. And one of the reasons I ran for office the first time, and one of the things that drives my service, is this my campaign slogan is committing to community. And I'm not just saying that I'm committing to this community. I'm saying what do we need to change policy wise in our state so that we all actually have the time and space to commit to our communities.
Right.
For that to be a priority. So for the noise to recede a little bit from our lives so we can connect with each other and commit to each other and care for each other. And so that's the vision. And the fact that I get frustrated that people aren't participating in democracy and it's somehow my fault is so funny to me, because like my entire sort of theory of change is that like none of us have the time and space to do that because the economy is crushing us. So
Mm.
from that vision to what needs to change, I got the reformers like publishing this series of columns where the legislator, like candidates, are sort of like answering the questions, and they're publishing the answers to our questions.
Oh yeah,
And it was,
they're sending you written questions.
yes, they sent us written questions, and it was 4 separate questions, and we had 500 words to answer these 4 separate questions total. It's not 500 words per question, unfortunately. And it was like, what will you do to solve the housing crisis? What will you do about the connected issues of the opioid epidemic and crime rates going up? What will you do to make the economy vibrant? And what's another policy that's important to you? And like, obviously, those are 4 issues that like, 1, involve more complexity than 500 words. 2, even the questions themselves need unpacking before they're answered. But 3 and 4, those are like really deeply integrated issues that can't be answered in isolation. So thank you for allowing me the web, Olga. I think this is like co-host privilege I'm taking, and I love it. So
a little bit, but that's okay.
What?
A little bit, but that's okay.
It is okay. I've earned it.
Yes, you did.
So the first thing that needs to happen is like people need more financial space in their lives, right?
Yeah.
And in Vermont, where the majority of businesses are small businesses, meaning that the majority of people are employed by small businesses, is something that we like love and celebrate and think is like so sweet and Vermonty, and in some ways really is, because it means that like more people have their hands in more things, and things are sort of at a more human level. It also means that like benefits are few and far between. And it means that it's very expensive for employers to provide benefits, because the way America is set up to do those things at scale, it's like much less expensive to do those things at scale. And it also means that workers' ability to negotiate and the power of unions and like sort of working class power is really like deeply diluted, because there are so many employers, so many bosses to negotiate with. And I'm sure that like every small business owner doesn't want to think of themselves as a boss. And I like get that. I'm sure it's how I would feel. Most of you are like, you know, most of them are very nice people doing the best they can. And there's not like that much space most of the time in an organization between the workers and the boss. But it means that sort of traditional modes of improving economic conditions for working people aren't as relevant in Vermont as they are other places. And so the government really does need to step in a different way. And so I think we need to provide like basic social infrastructure to all Vermonters, because employers can't do it here in a way that wouldn't like deeply impact wages, which are already so low in our state. So we need to have universal family medical leave. We need to have universal, affordable, accessible childcare. We need to have universal health insurance. And if we do that,
and it makes sense, because as you were saying, in the rest of the country, businesses take on these responsibilities because there is that scale.
Yes.
You know, just picking on Amazon, Walmart, I mean, pick any big company, they have that scale. And in Vermont, we've such a small population that the state as a whole is really...
It's smaller than most businesses who provide those benefits.
Yeah, that's our economies of scale right there, is the state level. Yeah.
So if the state can do that on behalf of businesses and on behalf of workers, so that businesses don't need to provide that and can then focus their revenues on wages, that would make a big difference. Employers that are already providing those would save money, because they would be operating within a larger scale to do it. And businesses that don't would then have the opportunity to do so. And we know that benefits, all 3 of those benefits, healthcare, family medical leave, and affordable accessible childcare, actually improve people's work. So when people have those benefits, They are able to focus more on the workplace. They are more likely to stay in their jobs for longer. They're more likely to sustain all those things. So that's one thing. It's sort of that basic social infrastructure provided at the state level because the state is the best place to do it. I don't know if I would feel that way if I was in a different state. I mean, I probably would, but like, I think it's a really good case here.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we need to do, because again, people are not in a position to negotiate these working conditions with their employers because the relationships are so personal, the power dynamics are so extra complex, is a lot of the working conditions that happen in unionized workplaces, I think the state needs to provide on behalf of all workers here in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to strengthen working conditions. We need to have just cause employment. Right now, people can be fired at any time in Vermont for any reason.
Yeah.
That's not true in a unionized workplace. We could do that for all Vermonters.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to have reliable and flexible work schedules, again, something available in unionized workplaces, we could do that throughout Vermont. We have lots of Vermonters who are working, especially in the service economy, who their schedules are actually created by computer algorithms based on when busier times in that business might be.
Mm-hmm.
And they're expected to be available during those times and not available during those other times in ways that like it's almost impossible to build a life. They don't have the same schedule week to week. How do you even make a doctor's appointment in that situation?
Yeah.
So those like really sort of basic workers' rights, non-compete agreements, which I sort of was like one of my projects in my first year when I was like getting my footing on how to move a bill. Things like that, just like really core workers' rights, I think would also then create the working conditions for Vermonters along with that social infrastructure that the economy was not sort of eating them alive.
Mm-hmm.
If we have that, that's sort of like one place that we make Vermont livable so that we have space for communities. The other space is like really getting our heads around what is the environment for.
Before we go on to environment, can I go back to the economy for a second? You talked about basic social infrastructure. I didn't hear you bring up like retirement benefits.
Oh, I would definitely put that in there. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We actually like we've almost succeeded at that. So we've been working on a project with the Treasurer's Office for quite a few years now to have Vermont have its own retirement benefit system that's sort of separate from a unionized workplace that people could opt into or employers could opt into on behalf of employees.
Oh, that's cool.
And so that is like supposed to launch very, very soon. Treasurer Pierce said she wanted to do it before she got out of office. I don't think that will happen, but it's certainly something that Mike Beachek is interested in carrying on. So I'm really excited about that. I'm sorry I didn't mention that.
Yeah, no, that is exciting. And I think crucial in an aging, when we have such a large aging population.
It's crucial in an aging population. It's also crucial in an environment where people are much more mobile in their work lives and people don't stay in the same position for 20 years. It's really hard to have your retirement tied to your employer. I, for instance, have no retirement at all, though I have like a weird little bucket of retirement that still sits with the state from when I worked there that just like I'm like I don't know what to do with this thing.
My day job is the first time I've started building a retirement.
Yeah. So like what we're like both gonna have like $20,000 in retirement when we turn 65. Like that's not gonna help anything. Yeah. No. Okay. Another piece of social infrastructure is I talked about early care and education. It's also access to education and training after high school in a robust way that doesn't put us in debt for the rest of our lives so that we can make meaningful choices about how and where we spend our time.
Yeah.
Thank you. For any listeners that are not aware, the debt relief program is now live. It went live beta testing this weekend. It is now live fully this week. It is the briefest form I have ever filled out in my life. I actually went to it on my smartphone just to see what the form looked like, to see how much energy I needed to build up before I filled it out. And I just finished it on my smartphone in like 60 seconds, people. It is the best form a government has ever created. I wish there was no form, because I know they already have the information. They could just forgive my loan, that piece of my loan without it, relieve that piece of my loan without it. But anyway, if you didn't know and you think you might in any way be eligible for student loan relief, it is 60 seconds and you can do it from your smartphone.
Yay.
Yay. And so Vermont, I think, is not going to be able to do a lot for debt relief because of sort of the nature of our ability to raise revenue. But I think we can do a lot to reduce people's debt into the future, so that folks who are entering school now and into the future will not have to take on the same scale of debt that I did, for instance.
Fantastic.
Yes. Okay.
Environment. Thanks, honey.
I think Vermont sometimes is a little confused about, like, do we have an environment so that tourists can look at it? Do we have an environment so that we can eat? Do we have an environment so that we can have clean air? Those are three actually very different policy goals that do actually counteract each other a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I am very aware that sort of the recreation economy and the recreation in Vermont is mostly used by people of means, because you don't have time to like go. Most people who recreate have a lot of extra time.
Yes.
Or a lot of extra mental space. And so I think we need to really look deeply at how we value our family farms, how our family farms are supported in order to be caring for sort of a sustainable environment, not a recreational environment.
Yeah.
And I think in doing that, we will wind up with a farm economy and an environment that is more accessible to more people, that more people can get their produce and their eggs and their meat from a neighbor. And that means that we're both like more sustainable environmentally, and we're caring for ourselves and others in a way that's like much more deeply connected and committed.
Right. Okay. That makes me happy to hear. Farming is so interesting. I think, there was a time in the world's history where pretty much most people were farmers in some form or another. And in some cases, it could be more of a homestead farm. But for the most part, somebody was taking care of cows or chickens and a vegetable patch at the bare minimum. And we've reached a point in time where now it's reversed. A lot of people, most people aren't farmers. And I think as a result, we have in our head this romantic vision of farming, and we don't always understand what it really takes. And you see it in ways of how policy is made around farms. You see it in ways of, classic, when it's that time of the year to spread the manure on the field, everyone's like, it's stinky. We don't want that. And so I think that's my long way of saying, I think that's interesting, because a lot of what you're talking about are not just policy shifts, but like cultural shifts. Shifting to a culture where we expect this social infrastructure, and shifting to a culture where we have a better understanding of what it takes to farm and what it takes to support farms.
And I'll tell you, the farmers that I know that I spend the most time with are clear that the number one most important thing that I could do as a policymaker is to actually provide that social infrastructure for them.
Yeah.
They want healthcare and childcare and family medical leave for themselves, so that farming is a slightly less terrifying venture.
Yeah.
Because it is a highly risky financial venture to get into. And they want to know that they're safe and protected just as much as I do.
Well, it's also a risky venture every year, because you might have one year where the crops are great, and then the next year it's a drought, and you can't control that.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I want to be clear on is I think that if we provide that sort of economic space for people to um, live and eat and be with each other, that some other things are taken care of.
Mhm.
I think the sort of a saying in the prevention and recovery space around opioids is that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection.
Mhm.
And what I have experienced with the folks I've known that have really struggled with substance use, or more so the folks whose lives have been essentially destroyed by substance use, because those are two different things.
Mhm.
Desperate folks feeling really, disconnected from folks who aren't also desperate. Um, and taking away some of the long-term impacts and the short-term impacts from addiction, um, making, folks who are experiencing substance use who don't experience severe financial straits, generally their lives don't crumble and impact negatively lots of other people in the same way.
Mhm.
It's the financial desperation that is like
Mhm.
half of it in terms of societal impacts.
Yeah.
And the ability to move out of deep addiction and deep substance use with a little more financial space is much, much easier.
Mm.
So there's that.
Mhm.
And that's sort of like one of the knock-on effects, I think, of having an economy that really works for people, a caring economy.
Mhm.
Um, there's also the further participation in democracy that means that democracy is better informed by the people who are living in it. That makes all of the other policies better because more people are lending their voices to shaping government.
Mhm.
Um, so those are sort of like some of the connected web of effects if we sort of move one lever.
Yeah.
I know we're experiencing a housing crisis. I am like absolutely acutely aware of it. I
Mm.
have worked, near homeless services for a lot of my work life, and I still attend a lot of those community meetings, so I can really understand what's happening here. And we need to build more housing, and we need to build more kinds of housing, and we're doing that as fast as we can. And I'm so sad that we didn't for all the years that we should have been. And we need to better, regulate our housing so that people live in safe places. And it's just gonna take it's going to take a while for us to crawl our way out of this like really terrible dire straits we're in, and it's going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of public will, but
Mhm.
it feels like a less complex policy lever because the
Mm.
solution is genuinely just more housing and more kinds of housing.
Yeah. So we have just under 5 minutes before the end of
No.
the show. I know, right?
Ah,
So if you are reelected, what would be some of your policy focuses, focusi, um, this session or the
yeah.
upcoming session?
So a funny thing about power and gaining power in the state house is so I'm gonna, be in a leadership position on the Ways and Means Committee, likely.
Mhm.
And so a lot of my real opportunity to shift things is in the place of revenues. Um, so in the big picture, I really want to be talking more about how we should be designing our revenues in Vermont to meet the needs of
Mm.
Vermonters in a more robust way. Um, so we've talked about sort of the people's budget, and I think Interfaith Action talked about was it the moral economy? What was that? I can't remember the phrase right now.
Yeah, the moral economy.
The
Yeah.
moral economy. Um, and so want to be sort of talking about taxes and revenues in that way, that they're not like
Mhm.
necessarily a bad thing if they are designed so that people are paying their fair share and people aren't paying more than their fair share.
Right. Right.
Um, and that we're sort of taxing the right places and spaces in that way, and that we're raising sufficient funds to really meet Vermonters' needs. So that's like big picture what I'll be focusing on. I need to find revenue to pay for family medical leave and to pay for affordable, accessible childcare. Those are going to be like two big focuses. I want to think about how we tax housing and construction and all of that to make sure that we have the best policy environment possible, to make sure that we have the housing that meets people's needs. Continue to support schools and support schools adequately and fully, so that kids get their needs met and the teachers are supported. So those are all like the things I'll be doing sort of in my very specific little policy bucket that I have. And then I usually sponsor a lot of different bills. Being in the position that I'll likely be on Ways and Means, I'm actually, I shouldn't sponsor as many bills in other committees as usual. Because it's sort of, anyway. So I'm going to be narrowing my scope and handing off a lot of my like bill projects to other people. So I've had sort of a long time project on decriminalizing sex work. I'm really going to be handing that off to other members and supporting them in it. I have had like an ongoing project around right to repair legislation that I'm handing off to a new sort of coalition of members. There's like a bunch of bills like that that I'm really handing off to people and not carrying myself anymore. But I'm gonna still have a few bills which are around accountable government, because that's my little baby that I'm gonna keep bringing around. And so all of those workers' rights that I talked about that I think are so important, I'm going to be sponsoring a bill that basically asks any business or organization that's receiving money from the state is required to have those basic workers' rights in place. And so it's using sort of the spending power of the state as a policy lever towards improving working conditions for Vermonters. Similarly, I'm going to be sponsoring a bill that does reforms on the Vermont employment growth initiative that we talked about with Doug Hoffer a little bit last week, around just sort of more accountability. And then I'll be continuing to advocate for deep reforms in our substance use policy network, because that is something that needs to happen on behalf of Brattleboro. So I think I think those are all my big old policy goals, Olga. I'm sure I missed something.
Well, we are out of time. So even if you missed something, we don't have any more time to talk about it. I'll have to go to another show. So Emilie Kornheiser, if people want to reach out to you or learn more about you, how do they do that?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org, where you will find links to my email address and my Instagram and my Facebook and my Twitter and this podcast, as well as signing up for my newsletter that I send out about once a month. Website has not been updated with past newsletters as well as it could, because I haven't had an intern for the last few months. So if anyone wants to join my comms team, I am recruiting actively.
Good to know.
Yeah.
And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2, as well as wherever you find your podcasts, BCTV, and our Captivate page. Have a great weekend, everyone.